Mark Evers checked himself into Black Hollow Psychiatric Hospital, hoping for healing. But just 48 hours later, he vanished without a trace. His family's nightmare had only just begun. What happened inside those walls would unravel a decades-old conspiracy of missing patients, falsified records, and dark secrets buried deep beneath the hospital's surface. Mark Evers had always been the quiet one in his family, thoughtful, reserved, and deeply introspective. He often seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. Friends described him as kind but distant, the type of person who would do anything for others but rarely asked for help himself. For most of his life, Mark had managed to keep his struggles hidden beneath a carefully maintained exterior. But in the year leading up to his disappearance, those cracks began to show. After losing his job at a local tech company and going through a painful breakup, Mark's mental health deteriorated. He withdrew from his usual routines, stopped responding to texts, and missed family gatherings. His younger sister, Laura, became increasingly concerned. She described long, rambling phone calls where Mark sounded confused, paranoid, and afraid. He mentioned feeling like he was being watched and said he couldn't sleep because of the sounds in the walls. At first, Laura thought it was just stress or maybe a delayed reaction to grief. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that something was seriously wrong. Mark finally agreed to seek help, which brought a sense of relief to his family. He researched facilities on his own, and eventually chose Black Hollow Psychiatric Hospital. The name was unfamiliar to most, but its website painted a picture of a calm, secluded sanctuary focused on individualized treatment and privacy. It boasted a high staff-to-patient ratio, alternative therapies, and a philosophy rooted in rebuilding the whole person rather than just medicating symptoms. That appealed to Mark. He didn't want to feel like a number in a system. He wanted something more personal, something human. The hospital was tucked away in a forested area in northern Vermont, a place so remote it didn't even show up clearly on Google Maps. Laura offered to drive him, but Mark insisted on going alone. He wanted to do this for himself. That Monday morning, he packed a small bag, left a note thanking his family for their support, and drove away. Laura received a text when he arrived. Checked in, nervous, but I think I made the right choice. Talk soon. Later that night, they spoke on the phone. Mark said the place was quiet, almost eerily so, but the staff seemed kind. He mentioned the old building reminded him of a boarding school, creaky floors, high ceilings, long corridors. He laughed nervously and said it felt like something out of a movie. The next day, Laura didn't hear from him. She figured it was part of the intake process. Maybe they took his phone, or he was busy with therapy sessions. But by the following afternoon, something felt off. No messages, no call. She decided to wait until the evening, but her anxiety grew by the hour. Then the phone rang. It was the hospital. The woman on the line identified herself as the administrative coordinator. She said Mark had left the facility earlier that day, signing himself out. When Laura asked for details, the answers were vague. She was told Mark had requested to leave and that everything had been handled according to protocol. When Laura asked if they had contacted anyone to pick him up, or knew where he had gone, the woman simply replied that Mark had not provided that information. It didn't make sense. Mark didn't own a second vehicle, he had no friends in Vermont, and there were no buses that came out that far. Why would he leave without telling anyone? Laura tried calling his cell phone, but it rang from inside his room. A nurse found it still plugged into the wall, along with Mark's wallet, keys, and the small overnight bag he had packed. Everything was still there. Everything but Mark. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The official explanation made no sense, and the more Laura questioned it, the more the details unraveled. If Mark had truly signed himself out, why would he leave behind everything he owned? His phone still charging on the nightstand, his wallet sitting unopened on the desk, even his shoes were tucked neatly under the bed, untouched. Laura stood in his room at Black Hollow Psychiatric Hospital, the day after he was reported discharged, staring at the untouched belongings with a sick feeling building in her stomach. Something was wrong, deeply, undeniably wrong. She tried to stay calm as she spoke to staff, hoping for clarification, a nurse, a doctor, anyone who had seen him last. But everyone she spoke to offered the same rehearsed response. Mark had made a voluntary decision to leave and signed the necessary documents to do so. When Laura asked to see those documents, she was told they were unavailable due to patient privacy policy. She wasn't on the release form, they said, but she didn't believe them. Mark wouldn't have walked out without a word. He wouldn't have vanished into the woods alone, without even his jacket. Desperate for answers, Laura contacted the local police. At first they treated it like a low-priority missing person case. Mark was an adult. The hospital claimed he left of his own free will. There was no evidence of foul play, yet. But after Laura insisted something wasn't right, officers agreed to open a formal investigation. They returned to Black Hollow to request surveillance footage and staff interviews. The hospital cooperated on the surface, offering access to a limited selection of security tapes and promising full transparency. But what the footage revealed only deepened the mystery. At approximately on Tuesday morning, the day before Mark was reported missing, he was seen walking down a long hallway on the hospital's east side. He was dressed in a patient robe and slippers, walking calmly but with purpose. His head was down, and he didn't appear to be in distress. He passed by 3 cameras before turning a corner at the end of the corridor. That was the last image ever captured of him. After that, nothing. No footage of him returning. No footage of him entering another room. No sign of him at any exit, security checkpoint or parking lot. Detectives studied the footage again and again, eventually noticing something alarming, a gap. At exactly 2:09 a.m., the feed jumped forward by 7 minutes. A clear, unbroken stream of footage suddenly cut to black and resumed at 2:16 a.m. The camera had not malfunctioned. There was no power outage. The jump was artificial, a deliberate edit. When investigators confronted the hospital, the staff feigned ignorance. They claimed the missing footage was a glitch, or possibly a system error. But the rest of the hospital's surveillance showed no interruption. Only that one hallway, only during those 7 minutes. That hallway had no alternate exits, no stairwells, no doors, no maintenance hatches. It was a dead end. If Mark had reached the end, he would have had to turn around and come back. But he never did. He simply walked into the camera's view and disappeared. By the end of the week, Mark was officially listed as a missing person. Posters went up around the region. His face appeared on local news stations, accompanied by words like confusing circumstances and hospital disappearance. The hospital's administrators released a brief public statement, expressing concern and stating they were fully cooperating with law enforcement. Behind the scenes, however, they began limiting access to records and discouraging staff from speaking to reporters. Laura remained in the area, refusing to leave without answers. She kept thinking about the hallway, the way Mark had vanished just beyond the edge of the screen. It didn't feel like a mistake. It didn't feel like someone running away. It felt like something much worse. The hallway where Mark Evers was last seen became the focal point of the investigation. Narrow, dimly lit and lined with identical white doors, it seemed like any other corridor in Black Hollow Psychiatric Hospital. But unlike the others, this one led nowhere. At the far end was a solid brick wall. No windows, no emergency exit, no indication of construction or recent changes. Detectives walked the length of it multiple times, testing each doorknob, checking every inch for hidden panels or structural irregularity. Nothing stood out, except the fact that it made no logical sense for a hallway to end in a wall. The hospital's layout was strange to begin with. Built in the 1930s and expanded over decades, its design was a confusing maze of add-ons, sealed-off wings and outdated architectural quirks. Some areas had been modernized, but others felt untouched since the mid-20th century. The East Wing, where Mark was last seen, was one of the older sections, less populated, dimmer and strangely quiet even during daytime hours. According to floor plans submitted to police, that particular hallway was intended for short-term observation rooms, though it was rarely used. Staff claimed it was part of a temporary overflow unit, but when detectives reviewed patient records, no one besides Mark had been assigned to that wing for weeks. Security footage only deepened the mystery. Investigators obtained the raw files, hoping to retrieve the missing 7 minutes the hospital claimed were lost due to a technical glitch. They brought in digital forensics experts who confirmed that the footage had been manually altered. The gap wasn't caused by corrupted data or a hardware malfunction. Someone with access had deliberately cut the section where Mark would have reached the end of the hallway. Worse, they had overwritten the original files, making it impossible to recover what had been deleted. Attention quickly turned to who had access to the surveillance system. Black Hollow operated on a closed network, and only a small number of senior staff held administrator-level credentials. When questioned, the hospital's head of security claimed he was unaware of any edits, and insisted no one on his team would tamper with evidence. Yet he couldn't explain why the logs showed a remote login into the system around 3:00 a.m., less than an hour after Mark's final appearance on camera. The login came from an internal terminal that was supposedly decommissioned months earlier. It was located in a section of the hospital that had since been sealed off. The sealed area, an adjacent wing with reinforced double doors, was said to be condemned after a fire in the early. Blackened windows and a warped entry door supported that claim, but when investigators tried to gain access, they were denied. Hospital administrators cited safety concerns and structural instability. They claimed no patients or staff had entered that wing in decades. Still, one officer noted a faint but distinct trail of scuff marks on the floor leading toward the sealed doors, like something had been dragged or moved recently. More troubling was a discovery made by a young nurse who had only been working at the facility for a few months. Anonymously, she contacted the police and reported that 2 days before Mark disappeared, he had expressed fear of being taken to the lower wing. He had asked if patients ever went there alone, and mentioned hearing voices in the walls during the night. The nurse initially thought it was part of his condition, but after hearing about his disappearance, she began to wonder if he had known something others didn't. The deeper investigators looked, the more questions emerged. Why was Mark placed in an almost abandoned section of the hospital? Why was his security footage tampered with? And why was the only hallway he walked down, the one that led to a dead end, the same hallway with 7 minutes missing from the tape? Nothing about it added up. Mark didn't just vanish, he was As the investigation into Mark Evers's disappearance gained traction, the case began to shift from a missing persons report to something far more disturbing. Detectives started combing through hospital records, hoping to find inconsistencies or patterns that might point to negligence or worse. It didn't take long for those patterns to emerge. One detective noticed something curious. The hospital had a history of patients leaving under unusual circumstances. Not dozens, but enough to raise concern. 5 other individuals had reportedly signed themselves out over the past 15 years, all within 48 to 72 hours of being admitted. Each case shared strange similarities. Patients left without their belongings, families were never contacted, and in every instance the discharge paperwork was incomplete, vague, or outright missing. Most disturbing of all, none of those patients had ever been located or heard from again. These disappearances had never drawn major attention. In each case, the hospital had offered the same explanation: the patient had chosen to leave. Because Black Hollow accepted voluntary admissions, patients technically had the right to discharge themselves at any time. That legal loophole had protected the hospital for years. Without strong evidence of wrongdoing, police departments, especially small, under-resourced ones, closed the files with little follow-up. But now, with Mark's case drawing statewide attention, those old files were reopened. Detectives interviewed family members of the other missing patients. Their stories were heartbreakingly familiar. One woman described her brother's admission to Black Hollow. He had been struggling with bipolar disorder, and checked himself in after a manic episode. 2 days later, the hospital told her he had walked out without warning. She never saw him again. Another woman recounted her teenage son's admission in 2018 following a severe anxiety breakdown. He vanished within 36 hours, and the hospital said he had become non-compliant and chose to leave. He was 17 at the time. No missing persons alert was ever issued. In all of these cases, something was missing. Basic documentation. Discharge forms lacked signature. Dates and times didn't match staff schedules. Some files were altered digitally weeks or even months after the supposed departure. There were even notes attributed to staff members who no longer worked at the hospital, or in one case had died before the patient's disappearance. These inconsistencies were not random. They formed a trail of deliberate falsification. The deeper investigators went, the more they realized how little oversight Black Hollow had faced. The hospital was privately funded, with a large portion of its budget coming from an anonymous foundation. It had passed inspections on paper, but former employees started to paint a different picture. Several described understaffing, poorly kept records, and a culture of silence. Staff were discouraged from asking questions about missing files. When leave, he was 17 at the time. No missing persons alert was ever issued. In all of these cases, something was missing. Basic documentation, discharge forms lacked signature, dates and times didn't match staff schedules, some files were altered digitally weeks or even months after the supposed departure, there were even notes attributed to staff members who no longer worked at the hospital, or in one case had died before the patient's disappearance. These inconsistencies were not random, they formed a trail of deliberate falsification. The deeper investigators went, the more they realized how little oversight Black Hollow had faced. The hospital was privately funded, with a large portion of its budget coming from an anonymous foundation. It had passed inspections on paper, but former employees started to paint a different picture. Several described understaffing, poorly kept records, and a culture of silence. Staff were discouraged from asking questions about missing files. When patients disappeared, they were told not to talk about it. One former orderly admitted that he'd been present during one such departure. He remembered a patient being taken from his room at 3 a.m. by two individuals who weren't part of the hospital's regular staff. They wore plain clothes, carried no identification, and gave no explanation. The next day, the patient was gone, and the staff was informed that he had checked himself out during the night. The orderly left the hospital shortly after, haunted by the memory and fearful of retaliation. At this point, the case reached the attention of federal investigators. Black Hollow had moved beyond being a local concern. The number of missing patients, the falsified documents, and the hospital's refusal to provide unaltered footage or full access to its records made it clear something was being hidden. What started with Mark Evers was quickly becoming a web of disappearances stretching back nearly 2 decades, and all of it pointed to one place, the heart of Black Hollow itself. The investigation's focus narrowed to a part of Black Hollow few had seen and even fewer understood, the East Wing. This was the oldest section of the hospital, built in the 1930s, and officially closed off following what the hospital described as a minor electrical fire in 19. But discrepancies soon emerged. State fire records showed no documentation of a blaze at Black Hollow that year or any year. No insurance claims, no fire marshal's report, nothing. And yet the wing was completely sealed, its windows blackened with soot, its doors locked behind rusted chains. Detectives requested access to the East Wing but were met with resistance. The hospital cited structural instability, insisting it was unsafe to enter. When pushed further, they claimed the wing was condemned and used only for storage, but an anonymous tip changed everything. A former staff member, an orderly who had worked at the hospital in the early 2000s, contacted investigators with a startling revelation. The East Wing hadn't been empty at all. According to him, it was used for what he called special cases, patients who didn't respond to normal treatment. He said the wing had its own entrance through the lower level, bypassing the main hospital floors entirely. Patients were moved there at night. He remembered the scream. With this new information, detectives secured a warrant and entered the East Wing under the supervision of engineers and fire inspectors. The outer corridors were choked with dust and debris, paint peeled from the walls in long curling strips. The air smelled of mold and something older, something chemical. Old medical carts and broken gurneys lay scattered in the shadows. Some rooms had beds still made, as if waiting for patients who never returned. But it was the inner rooms deeper in the wing that raised the most alarm. These rooms had been stripped of furniture, but not of their function. Hooks were bolted into concrete walls, straps still dangled from metal bed frames. One room had a chair with restraints worn through at the edges, another had a viewing window built into the door, similar to an interrogation room. There were no signs these spaces had ever been used for healing. The discovery cast everything in a new light. If the East Wing was still in use well after its supposed closure, what else was the hospital hiding? Investigators began to suspect the wing had been repurposed for off-the-books treatment, something not sanctioned, not regulated, and kept entirely out of patient records. Worse, the layout revealed a troubling truth. A staircase near the far end of the wing led to an underground corridor that connected directly to the hallway where Mark Evers was last seen. It had been bricked up at the entrance, but clearly once allowed movement between the floors. The idea that Mark could have walked into that hallway and been taken downstairs without anyone seeing, without security noticing, was no longer far-fetched. It was plausible, and the missing 7 minutes of footage suddenly made more sense. If Mark had been intercepted at the end of the hall, and moved into that sealed lower corridor, the edit in the footage may have been used to cover up his abduction. That same week, another former nurse came forward. She had worked at Black Hollow for just under a year before quitting abruptly. She said she once caught a glimpse of the east wing door open late at night. A man in a white coat was pushing a gurney with a patient strapped down. She didn't recognize the man. When she mentioned it to her supervisor the next day, she was told never to speak of it again. That part of the hospital doesn't exist, the supervisor had said. But now, standing inside its crumbling remains, investigators knew it had existed, and something terrible, had happened there. As investigators dug into the hospital's past, they began looking for anyone connected to the East Wing during the years it had allegedly been in operation. Most current staff denied ever entering it. Many claimed they didn't even know it was accessible. But when investigators accessed archived staffing records from the 1980s, a name surfaced again and again: Dr. Harold Wexler. He had been the chief psychiatrist at Black Hollow from 1979 until his unexplained disappearance in 19... Wexler's name appeared to be just another entry in a long-forgotten file, but the more investigators uncovered about him, the more disturbing the picture became. He had overseen dozens of patients during his tenure, many of whom were transferred into a special treatment program labeled only as Protocol V. These patients were never listed in discharge logs. No death certificates, no follow-up therapy reports, they simply vanished from the system. His notes, if they existed, had been scrubbed from the hospital's archives. Only fragments remained, illegible entries, shredded memos and the occasional signature on old lab requisitions. Former employees who had worked under Wexler described him as brilliant but reclusive, and deeply unorthodox. He didn't believe in conventional treatment. Instead, he was obsessed with what he called rewiring the emotional brain. He reportedly experimented with sleep deprivation, isolation, and audio stimulation therapies. One former nurse, now retired, remembered patients being placed in dark rooms for days at a time, with white noise machines blasting non-stop. Some came out unrecognizable, others were never seen again. Rumors swirled that Wexler had been conducting unsanctioned experiments, but nothing was ever proven. In 1987, he failed to show up for work one day. His office was empty, his personal effects gone. The hospital claimed he had resigned abruptly and moved overseas. No forwarding address, no farewell message, just an empty space where he once stood. No official missing persons report was ever filed. In fact, many staff believed the hospital had deliberately covered up his disappearance to avoid scrutiny from medical boards and state regulators. When investigators tried to track Wexler through his medical license, they found something even stranger. It had never been formally revoked. Instead, it had quietly expired years ago. There was no disciplinary record, no official reprimand, just a digital footprint that vanished after. Attempts to locate him through Social Security, tax filings, or even death records came up empty. It was as if he had erased himself, but his presence lingered inside Black Hollow in more than just paperwork. Investigators found a storage closet in the lower basement, tucked behind rusted supply shelves, sealed with an old padlock. Inside were remnants of Wexler's work. The stairwell was narrow and steep, lit only by the weak beams of the team's flashlights. At the bottom, they found a short corridor with faded tile floors, water-stained ceilings, and cracked walls. Pipes ran along the ceiling like veins, leaking at the joints, dripping into the silence. The hallway led to a series of windowless rooms, what appeared to be a forgotten wing of the hospital, far older than the structures above it. Inside these rooms they found rusted restraints bolted into bed frames, some with torn leather cuffs still attached, chairs with metal harnesses, outdated medical devices lined up against the walls, machines with broken dials and screens, some labeled in faded ink with strange codes. One chamber appeared to be a sealed observation room, with a thick pane of one-way glass facing into an empty space that smelled of bleach and something faintly metallic. A built-in speaker system was wired through the wall, the microphone still intact. These were not rooms for treatment, they were for observation, control, containment. Scattered across a metal table were files that had escaped the digital scrub. Most were brittle and water-damaged. but still legible. They referenced trial extensions and long-form exposure sessions. Patients were reduced to codes and acronyms. No names, no diagnoses, just notes about response time, cognitive shifts and behavior breakdowns. Some pages were marked with red ink. No recovery. Transfer to quiet. In one locked cabinet, investigators found a collection of audio tapes. Many were unlabeled, but a few had initials matching missing patients, including M.E. Mark Evers. When played, the tapes revealed muffled audio, low humming sounds, mechanical whirring and occasionally, the sound of a person breathing heavily, muttering incoherently. One recording included a man repeating the same phrase over and over for nearly 2 minutes. They come when the lights go out. They come when the lights go out. What was most unsettling was that the rooms showed recent activity. Though the wing had supposedly been closed for decades, some beds were stripped clean with linens folded on nearby chairs. Fresh footprints dotted the dust-covered floor. One light fixture flickered weakly from a power source that should have been disconnected long ago. This was where the missing patients had gone. Not out the front doors but down into the dark, buried beneath layers of denial and bureaucracy. It was no accident. Someone was still using this space, continuing the same methods pioneered by Dr. Wexler, under a new name and new leadership. Mark Evers had walked into Black Hollow seeking help. Instead, he had descended, literally, into a system designed to silence suffering through control, not compassion. Now investigators stood in the cold, echoing depths of the hospital, surrounded by the shadows of the lost, finally face to face with the hidden machinery that had consumed them. The chilling discoveries in the sub-basement of Black Hollow raised immediate questions. Who was currently running this hidden operation, and how had it remained undetected for so long? Investigators returned to the hospital's administrative records, focusing on the leadership team and anyone with the authority to control both patient admissions and hospital security. As they pieced together the puzzle, a troubling figure emerged. Evelyn Carter, the nurse whose digital account had been used to alter patient records years after her death. At first the idea seemed impossible. How could someone who had died still be accessing hospital systems? But further investigation revealed a disturbing practice. Carter's credentials had been kept active deliberately. Instead of revoking or deleting her login information after her passing, the hospital's IT systems maintained it as a backdoor. The account was used to manipulate patient files and conceal evidence of disappearances. Staff who raised concerns about these irregularities were transferred, dismissed, or told to stay silent. Digging deeper into Dr. Carter's history revealed that she had been a trusted figure at Black Hollow for over 30. Starting as a nurse's aide, she quickly rose through the ranks due to her loyalty and compliance with hospital leadership. She was present during the later years of Dr. Wexler's tenure and had taken on administrative responsibilities after his disappearance. Those who worked closely with her described her as cold but efficient, someone who maintained order at any cost. Anonymous sources revealed that Dr. Carter had been instrumental in continuing Protocol V, under a new name, Continuity Protocol. It wasn't just an outdated relic. It was an ongoing program designed to control patients deemed difficult or dangerous by subjecting them to secretive psychological and physical treatment. The goal, they said, was to erase symptoms by erasing parts of the patients themselves. Memories, identities, emotions. Hospital board members claimed ignorance of the details, but leaked internal emails suggested they were complicit, or at least willfully blind. One email from 2017 read, "Maintain discretion on the lower levels. Patient turnover must remain confidential. No external audits allowed." Another warned staff about unauthorized inquiries, threatening termination and legal action. A former technician who had worked in the hospital's IT department confirmed that the network had hidden layers accessible only through special credentials like Dr. Carter's. He described how data was routinely manipulated to erase records of patients transferred to the East Wing or the lower levels. He said the practice had started in the early 2000s and escalated in the last decade, growing increasingly sophisticated to avoid detection. The investigation now had a face, a person who symbolized the institution's darkest secrets. But when officials attempted to question staff connected to Dr. Carter, they found an eerie silence. Many had left Black Hollow quietly or refused to cooperate. Some had disappeared just like the patients. What no one expected was that the office of Dr. Carter still existed, untouched behind a locked door on the third floor. Inside, investigators found stacks of files, detailed journals and plans for new treatment. Among these were handwritten notes referencing Mark Evers by name. One entry described him as a promising candidate for accelerated protocols, and recommended immediate transfer upon stabilization. Another contained a list of names, patients missing in recent years, some still unaccounted for. The files also included photographs, some candid and some clinical, documenting patients' conditions before and after treatment. The stark contrast was horrifying, faces showing signs of trauma, confusion, and in some cases, near catatonia. It became clear that Mark Evers had never left Black Hollow. He had been absorbed into this shadow program, his existence erased in the hospital's official records, his fate sealed in the depths below. As the investigation grew, the media spotlight intensified. The public demanded answers and pressure mounted on Black Hollow's board and the local government. The hospital was forced to shut down its operations temporarily. Authorities promised a full federal inquiry, but the most haunting question remained unanswered. Where was Mark Evers now? And how many others were still trapped inside the nightmare that Black Hollow had created? With mounting public pressure and the overwhelming evidence uncovered, Black Hollow Psychiatric Hospital was finally shut down indefinitely. The authorities promised a full-scale federal investigation to unravel the decades-long mystery of disappearances, cover-ups, and human rights violations. But even as the hospital's gates closed and the media swarmed the grounds, the fate of Mark Evers and the countless other missing patients remained a haunting question, with no clear answer. Searches were launched in the hospital's underground corridors and forgotten rooms, hoping to find survivors or remains. Forensic teams scoured the east wing and sub-basement, cataloging every scrap of evidence, every whispered secret hidden in the peeling wall. Yet despite their thorough efforts, no sign of Mark Evers or many of the other vanished patients surfaced. It was as if they had been swallowed by the building itself. The investigation revealed that Black Hollow had operated under layers of deception for decades, with management, staff and even some local officials complicit in maintaining a sinister status quo. The hospital had functioned as a black hole where patients went in seeking help but were instead lost to a system designed to erase inconvenient individuals quietly. The continuity protocol and its predecessors had enabled a process of control that stripped patients of their identities and voices, leaving behind only silence. Public outrage was swift and fierce. Survivors who had escaped or been released shared chilling accounts of isolation, sensory deprivation and experimental treatments that left lasting psychological scars. Families of missing patients demanded justice, their grief reignited by the revelation that their loved ones had likely been subjected to cruel and secretive abuses. Lawsuits piled up and calls for sweeping reform in psychiatric care echoed across the nation. Despite these developments, certain questions continued to haunt investigators. Where exactly had the missing patients been taken? The evidence pointed toward the underground levels, but those spaces were vast, labyrinthine, and only partially mapped. Many corridors remained blocked or inaccessible due to structural decay and safety concerns. Rumors persisted of hidden rooms, locked away forever, containing those who never returned to the world above. Even more troubling was the absence of clear accountability. Evelyn Carter had died years earlier, and many of the hospital's key personnel had disappeared or refused to cooperate. The board members claimed ignorance or shifted blame, and some lower-level staff remained tight-lipped out of fear or loyalty. It became clear that Black Hollow's darkest operations were orchestrated by a network that extended beyond the hospital walls, a network invested in preserving secrecy and silencing dissent. In the months following the shutdown, investigators uncovered cryptic references to off-site facilities and private treatment centers used to house patients under the continuity protocol. These places, allegedly linked to powerful donors and foundations that funded Black Hollow, operated with little oversight. The trail grew cold, but the implication was clear. The nightmare extended far beyond the hospital's immediate ground. Amid the bleak revelations, a faint glimmer of hope emerged. A few former patients long considered lost, resurfaced after years of silence. Some were found wandering confused in nearby towns, others were discovered in private care homes, their memories fragmented but alive. These survivors spoke of the horrors they endured and the resilience it took to escape. Mark Evers's family refused to give up. They joined advocacy groups, pushing for greater transparency and demanded that the government allocate resources to continue the search. New technology, including ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging, was deployed to probe inaccessible parts of Black Hollow's foundation, but no definitive trace of Mark was ever found. Black Hollow Psychiatric Hospital became a symbol of institutional failure and a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power within mental health systems. The story of Mark Evers and the countless others who vanished into its walls served as a somber reminder of the human cost when compassion is replaced by control, and healing is sacrificed for secrecy. The hospital stood empty, a decaying monument to decades of silence, its windows like dark eyes watching a world that had finally begun to ask the difficult questions. What happened behind those locked doors may never be fully known, but the echoes of the lost patients and the shadows of their stories continue to haunt those who dare to uncover the truth. In the end, Black Hollow's nightmare was not just about one man's disappearance. It was about the many who walked in seeking help and vanished into a nightmare from which there was no escape.